Yep. Hello. So I'm Usman Akinyemi, and we're talking about my journey as a student in open source, and like my core contributions, and like just my personal experience about doing open source, participating in Git. Yeah. Let's start. So like Git, who am I? So I'm a final year student of computer science and artificial intelligence in Plaksha University, India, and my journey so far have actually been shaped by a lot of participating in open source projects. So if you know System D, I created a unit testing framework in System D. If you know X5, I was working on creating some codifying the assembly instructions. And at Git, like under Outreachy program, I added like uname info to the Git HTTP user agent, and I just completed my Google Summer of Coding internship, where I actually built a medical imaging pipelines. So these are like my open source journey so far, and I'm a fan of Linux. I love Linux, and also like I love talking about Linux, and I enjoy working on system software developer tools. And as I already said, like most of my journeys have been shaped by working on open source project and navigating open source world. So like my first time of using Git was actually in an hackathon, in a hackathon where I was working with a friend. I didn't even know how to like use it. So like the friend had to like help me to like, push all my code to GitHub. And later like, got to like actually like learn Git when I had to like, submit my assignment on GitHub through like ALX software engineering program, which is like a software engineering program for African students. So like I don't know if like how many of you probably like if you're an open source contributor, like how many of you can remember like your first open source contribution and what it felt like? So like okay, like coming to like how like my open source journey, like finding out about open source. Like I found out about open source in my first year, and like the idea of open source actually like resonated with me so fast. So like what are the reason like that makes open source to resonate with me so fast? I think the first one is in my first year I learned like a lot of programming language, C++, Python, Bash scripts. Like they all feel so like theoretical, maybe not theoretical. We have to write maybe some code to write, maybe to reverse a linked list, all those sort of things. But like I felt like I need to like apply my, all whatever I'm learning in a practical setting. Like this concept actually useful. So open source provide that. Then also like I also don't like working on I don't like working on projects just for like just for fun sake. I want to work on a project for fun, but like a real world software project, like that is actually like making impact. And I also learned that while working on open source, you could actually get the opportunity to like work with world class engineers, right? So that's also there, and also like the opportunity for career growth. Like you learn a lot of things, you work on lot of projects, and you gain experience. So those are the reasons that actually made open source to resonate with me, right? And like my first open source project, like first open source experience was kind of horrible sometimes, and whenever I remember it, I sort of get some maybe goosebumps or something. It's like it took me a month to actually compile my first open source project. Like for a whole month, I was just trying to like compile the project, not even like contribute to the project. And I sort of say I still remember those like late evenings after like coming back from classes, like long classes, I'm there on my laptop compiling LLVM. It's actually hit up all my computer processes, and I just wait there and hope my computer like stop getting stuck and stuff like that. Sometimes I have to like uh you know shut it down and start again from the beginning. So it's I remember those late nights, they were not that good. So like I think what kind of make open source so hard for me, like at the beginning, was that there was not really like a kind of a big community support at my college, like that does open source. It's like I'm on my own, right? So I also started with a very complex code base. If you know LLVM, it's a sort of complex code base that a new beginner does not want to start with. And also in LLVM, there is not really a good first issue, like as a beginner, what can you actually do? And there is a sort of sparse documentation on how things work, maybe a simple like documentation on how you can actually even compile LVM. It's not like there is no like a centralized place for that. And also like it was my first time, so I don't really know how open source works. So I was so naive. I couldn't ask for help in the community. Maybe if I had asked for help, it will have solved my problem of trying to like compile LLVM. So I actually like later learned that, assuming if I had used like this particular command, and I kind of assigned the number of processors to like compile LLVM, that will have solved my issue. I will have been able to like compile the LLVM maybe in just a day. But like I didn't know about this command, so I had to like so like the LLVM compilation was just eating up all my processes processor. Yeah. So like so applying to Outreachy and picking it, like how do I come about Git? Like, how do I come to like join and contribute to Git? So Outreach is basically a kind of project or organization that sort of connects students and open source beginners to like open source projects where they can actually contribute to. So like I applied to Outreach in August 2024 and I choose to like contribute to like Git and LibreOffice. So the reason why I choose like these two projects is that I use both of them daily. I use because I run Linux, so I use LibreOffice for like my typing and all sorts, and I use Git for like my pushing my project. And I also like choose them because it's in C and C++, which I also know. So like so like I got selected for the two projects, and it's very like a very rare fit in Outreachy, and I choose to work on Git. And the reason why I choose to work on Git is that like Git contribution guideline is so very detailed. Like you have a guideline that actually say, okay, this is how you actually make your first contribution. Like I believe if you even if you don't know like about bash scripting or C, if you actually go through the Git contribution guideline, you can actually like make a contribution without knowing those particular language, like which Git is written in. So it has a very detailed contribution guideline and also like a very clear mark beginner friendly usually like what you can actually start with. And Git community, they're like very responsive. I've been to like some open source community where you actually probably have to beg the maintainer that please can you help me to review my issue, and for like weeks sometimes they don't even respond. My open source my so like I did my outreach internship with Git, and this is basically what I worked on. I worked on adding uname info to like Git HTTP user agent. The idea is if you look at this particular so this is the user agent string, and this happens like when there is an interaction between Git that is running on your local system and the one that is running on the server. Let's say like GitHub is a server and your local system, which is a your computer. So there is exchange of a particular string called user agent string, and it is in this format. But like after working on my open source, after working on the project, so I basically like extended it from here to this particular format, right? And the reason is that it helps in OS specific debugging OS specific issues in Git, and also like for for statistics purpose, right? It's like some of the other details which while working on on this particular project is that we only added the OS name due to concerns. Like we wanted to add like a lot of other informations, maybe maybe the architecture, maybe some other informations, but like we just stick to just having like just the operating system name, right? So and this is like concerns from the community, and also like we sort of instead of adding a new capability, so like we just like added it to like user agent capability, which is like this particular like string instead of like creating a new capability to add it to. So we just append it to that, right? And so there was also like some issue with testing on Windows. So we sort of like just disable testing on Windows, but like that's perfect. Like you don't have to worry that it is going to break on Windows. Like perfectly ensure that. And I had to like work on different iterations, and like Git community also like you have to like do good work. So I have to work on good different iterations, and sometimes maybe I've worked on something and someone, oh no, this is not like the right way. So that's that. And also like so some of the difficulties and learning which are along the line. So I think the first thing was actually like learning how to like contribute to Git. Like how do you send patch to Git? The irony is that Git does not use maybe GitHub or maybe GitLab or some other like sort of way to review your to send code and maybe all those things. But they use mailing lists where you sort of forward your patches, your changes, you send it through email to the mailing list. So that's like sort of weird to me. Like so it's there was a learning curve, but like I was later able to like pass that by actually like looking at the contribution guideline provided by Git. So they call it we call it hacking Git page. And I think the biggest takeaway in my Git journey is actually like writing a very good commit message. If you look at this particular like picture, like in Git, you don't write. I think it's also in Linux kernel also. Like you don't just write a particular like one line commit message. You have to write like why do you have to do this? What are the problems that you face? What is the existing solution before? Like it has to be detailed. And I think like after like working with Git, when I work with other projects, I sort of use this particular format, and I really love it. It's also like helped me while trying to like look at previous work on my own work at Git. So like I was able to like read through the commit messages and understand what has been done and what I like and the rationality before rationality, like why they have to do those things, right? So like how open source as I changed my life, like along the line. So firstly, I was able to like connect like some academic concepts to real life, real world large scale software development. Like my Git project involved me to like understand like to actually apply my computer networking concept. Like while working also like working on RIX 5. So I was able to like use my knowledge of RIX 5, RIX architecture in while working on RIX 5, my project at RIX 5. And also like I have like I've gained so much of confidence contributing to like complex code base. I sort of believe that there is no really how complex a code base can be. Like my journey as in open source has sort of like empower me to be able to like go to any code base and with help from the community make some contribution to the code base, right? And it's also like sort of improve my communication and collaboration skills, because in open source it's like communication. If you are going to like make any changes, you sort of have to like say the rationality behind the changes. So and you also have to like have a very good collab. Sometimes it's not even about the code, like it's also like about how you like communicate your idea to the other community member. So that's one of the things I learned. And also like ability to learn new technologies. I think most of my open source journey, like apart from probably like knowing the basic programming language behind, maybe like knowing C, like sometimes I have to like learn new frameworks so fast to be able to like make contribution to the project. So I think I've gained the skills of learning new technology very easily. And I've also worked on very meaningful and impactful projects. Like if anyone is out there is using Git, you probably have to like interact with some of the code which I've written in Git. So I think it's interesting concept. So career development, access to experts, like most of the people who review my code in Git, in Rigs, in systems, they're like experts from Funk company and from interesting companies. And also like contributed back to my community, like in terms of like open source. It's also like contributing back, a way of contributing back to my community, and also like sort of uh mentoring people to actually like contribute to open source. So like these are like some of the features I took, like this is my Google Sum of Code mentor. This is Kartik from GitLab, is part of the Git team, and this is my mentor. My Git mentor is also like he works at GitLab, Christian Kuda, and he's also like part of Git community. And this is me actually like teaching people how to like contribute to open source. So like my advice for beginner like who is trying to like come into like open source, I think pick a project like that you love, maybe based on your skills, based on what you know, or based on what you're interested in. And these are like sort of places where you can actually see a lot of like different open source organizations. So these are the links. And I think the other is you also have to like go through the contribution guidelines, find beginner friendly issues. Like there are most of these organizations, most of these open source organizations have written like well detailed contribution guidelines. Go through it and go through it and understand it. Then every almost all the community open source community has a community channel, right? So join the community channel. If you have any problem, ask them. Don't be shy. Then also like follow up on your patches. If you send a PR or what they call patches in Linux kernel and Git community, ensure that you follow up on it until you are able to like get it matched. And keep working on meaningful and impactful uh problems, right? So like if you want to like get started with Git, this is like the link to like Git contribution guideline, and it is well detailed. And also like my sort of advice for open source maintenance is that write a very detailed like compilation and build docs, like how can people build your project. It's very helpful. Like maybe if I've seen a well detailed compilation guideline, I wouldn't have used like 1 month trying to like build a LLVM project, right? So and also like respond to patches, like it really like encourage contributors. You might also think that maybe you are putting some time, but like at the side of from the point of view of a contributor to like imagine someone like me who had to like come back from class, had to like dedicate a lot of time to open source contribution. It's also like kind of mean a lot to me. So try and respond to patches and also like encourage asking question. Right, it really help a lot. And mentorship matters. I believe there will be a time when maybe the people who are currently like because in open source like you see like a lot of old people there, right? So there'll be a time where we need to like have young contributors also like mentoring them now we sort of ensure that we ensure the project future. So like Git commit, thank you everyone for listening to my talk. Thanks to the Git contributors for the opportunity to intern with Git. Thanks to my mentor Junior Amano, the Git maintainer Taylor Blau, Patrick. Thanks to my friend for also like formatting the slide for me. Thank you everyone. So and you can connect with me online. So Usman Akinyemi, it's like it's yeah. Thanks.